34th Street is one of the most iconic in New York, from the Empire State Building to Macy's and Madison Square Garden. But since 2012, New Yorkers have seen the construction of one of the most divisive and polarizing neighborhoods in city history, Hudson Yards. Welcome back to New York 101, and in today's episode we'll be building Hudson Yards, MSG, and the surrounding area. And later, in the live play, we'll look at some of the newly built out subway lines. And your first question really might be, what is Hudson Yards? For many of you familiar with New York, you'll know immediately what this is, but for those of you who don't, this is a massive, and I really do mean massive, complex on the west side of Manhattan, just off 34th Street, and bounded by 34th to about 30th, in between 10th and 12th Avenues, although what we will be building today is the only section which is still currently built, which is the section between 10th and 11th Avenues. And it consists of several buildings with different numbers like 10 and 30 and 35 Hudson Yards. And what's really wild about it is that 3 of those buildings are super talls. So these are skyscrapers that are over 300 meters in height, which is 984 feet for the Americans in the room. And Hudson Yards numbers 30, 35, and 50 are all over that height. And Hudson Yards 30 in particular far exceeds that height and has the second tallest outdoor observation deck in the Western Hemisphere, the Edge. Which, I mean, everything in this complex is named terribly. All the buildings just have numbers. Even that large square building, which is the Shops, it's just called the Shops at Hudson Yards. It's basically a mall, because if New York needs anything, it's a mall. The other aspect of this complex that you're probably very familiar with is the vessel. It's that honeycomb-shaped, some say shawarma-shaped, public art / interactive installation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We're going to detail that up pretty heavily. And overall, I think this build is probably one of the most detailed that I've done during this series. As I've often expressed, this is not a series which will ever have a ton of detailing because it's just a very, very large build. And the more props we put down, the more detailing we do, it means that there is less for us to actually build. And I'm trying to strike a balance between building out neighborhoods, filling in blocks, and spending my time detailing. But I think an area like this with these assets are just absolutely fantastic. And there's an asset for basically every building in here, although this area is rapidly expanding. There's some other buildings surrounding it, like the Spiral, which does not exist in the workshop yet, but is almost topped out in New York, which is not technically part of the complex. But the Hudson Yard complex has drawn in so many other opportunities for developers. And one of the main reasons for that, as you see we've put down, is a subway station. Now we'll actually look at that station in depth during the live play, showing exactly how it connects to the rest of the city, but it is already really seeing a lot of traffic. People potentially coming up the 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, and 3 that we built in a previous episode. Go check that out if you haven't. And also then shooting across town on the 7, because that is where the 7 goes. That was built as an extension to the subway system, which opened, I believe, in 2013, and is one of the major problems with this neighborhood. So let's start to talk about that a little bit more as well. Why is Hudson Yards so divisive in New York? And that's because in many ways, the biggest flaw it has is it doesn't really fit into how New York City's streetscape tends to work. And by that I mean, New York has these interconnected streets with ground-facing retail and a sense of community. And Hudson Yards just lacks that. You can see it's surrounded by large, heavily trafficked avenues with no traffic calming measures. You have enormous, massive buildings built right on top of one another. And they're not even residential as New York needs. Some of them are residential, but many of them are commercial as well. They are office buildings. There are some of the biggest companies in the country have offices in these buildings now. But because it's so secluded and it is so office focused, this area has really struggled during COVID. And a lot of shops in the mall have already closed, even though it's supposed to be a high-end facility, which makes no sense because you can just go to Fifth Avenue if you want that, right? And even as a public space, it tends to fail quite a little bit, you know, because it's so inaccessible, it is so far on the side of the island. It feels like it makes sense to be there if you are working there or you're out for a night out on the town, but as a day-to-day visiting spot, it isn't always perfect, although the High Line actually ends at this too, and there are some plans to extend how the High Line interacts with that part of the city. We won't be building the High Line today. I think that deserves its own time, since it should be really fun to play around with and detail that. And what I really think that Hudson Yards takes away from 34th Street in general is its iconic character. So you can see in the background there and at the beginning shots of this episode that we built the Empire State Building in our previous live stream, which happened a weekend or two ago, depending on exactly when I get this episode finished and out. But we had a really nice turnout once again, and I really appreciate all of you for being there. And one of the things that we did, besides you know, starting looking at Brooklyn and Williamsburg, so if you want to see some Brooklyn, go check that out. We also dropped down the Empire State Building because somebody asked for it, and it was a really good jumping off point to go from building that to then working my way into this build and doing Hudson Yards. And I thought that theme fit really well to kind of blend this all together. And it really is a blend. That iconic Macy's department store with that angled corner. Of course, if you know the lore, the very, very front corner of it is actually not owned by Macy's and or wasn't originally. So that's why that angle is so strange there. It's still a different shop, but another asset that I didn't actually even have when the last time I built New York out was Madison Square Garden. This asset is fantastic. It took a little finagling there for me to get it quite right working, but it really does fit in so well there. One thing you'll see me not build is Penn Station. So there is a Penn Station asset on the workshop, although it is the original Penn Station, and I'm not sure that the asset even works. I had tried it once in my previous New York build, and it like killed my save, so I won't even pretend to try it here. Plus, we're going for a modern day New York, and this is what it looks like. The problem is that there's really not any good underground train stations, and I just don't know how to bring trains into Penn Station. Now, they don't need to be through running because they're not through running in real life. So I'm gonna give some thought to this. I wanna see how far the map in New Jersey goes, because I'm even tempted to like let the outer train connection go into my fictional Secaucus and then transfer maybe to a metro and have that be a way of getting around the limitations. But I don't know, let me know what you think down below. This is always a tough problem to solve because the game does not really handle underground train stations very well, if at all. What we'll be doing for a little bit now is building out blocks. And one thing I wanted to focus on in some of these newer videos is building out blocks and not just building roads. I'm going to build most of the roads off camera. We're going to build roads on live streams, but try to avoid showing you that road view. I want to show you this being built out and one of the major challenges of building this area. New York's got a lot of tall buildings, and not even just a lot of tall buildings, but a lot of buildings that are in kind of an intermediate height that the game often doesn't have, or even there isn't a lot of great assets for it. Because assets, when they get that tall, I'm talking 500 to 1,000 feet, they often look very unique. But in New York, you have tons of buildings that are that height that are just relatively generic looking. So I have gone back onto the workshop and downloaded a few more buildings that were, you know, kind of just searched by height and found a few buildings that were 150 meters, 160, something in that range to give some more diversity to heights in the city. And you'll see that in the live play. I think it came out quite nice. Another thing that we're building out a little bit here in this episode, and not completely and certainly not finished and detailed, is the Lincoln Tunnel. And to me, this is another part of what makes the west side of Manhattan and the Hudson Yards area such a poor neighborhood. So not poor in terms of finances, because it's certainly an expensive area, but poor in terms of its livability, its walkability, and certainly its air quality. When we built out the Midtown Tunnel in a previous episode, or maybe that was a live stream, it's very compact. You know, it fits neatly into the neighborhood, despite what it is as being a car tunnel. But the Lincoln Tunnel is nothing like that. The Lincoln Tunnel has 3 different tubes, one incoming, one outgoing, and one that has a lane of each and is also reversible. For our build, it'll be one of each. It also connects into the Port Authority bus terminal, which we're not even going to think to start attempting today. and it connects south towards the Hudson Yards complex. So what we've going to be building on here is just enough of the Lincoln Tunnel to get Sims from off the map on the northwest intake that I have and getting them dumped out into Hudson Yards, because all of these Hudson Yard buildings have like, 150 residential units or 200 jobs in them. So you can see there's already a lot of hustle bustle around here. And we'll take a detailed look at that in the live play for sure. But God, the Lincoln Tunnel, just the way it interacts with the city, it's a scar. It is an absolute scar in the neighborhood. I can't stand it. I think it's one of the big reasons why I'm not a fan of the west side of Manhattan. And then you add Hudson Yards into it, which I don't care for. And you have Times Square not that far away. And it's just not my favorite part of the city. But it is interesting, and it does have a lot of history. I think I've made clear what I think about Hudson Yards. I know I haven't really talked about it too much, but it's just a difficult place to enjoy. It has some beautiful, tall, lovely buildings, and maybe it doesn't quite fit into the character of New York. But I'd like to hear from you down below. What do you think of Hudson Yards? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Have you never been? Do you never want to go? If you came to New York, is it a place that you would actually consider visiting? Or would you skip it because, please skip it, there's so many more better things you could be doing in New York. Because it's the greatest, isn't it? And we're going to be showing more of that greatest in the live play, which is coming up right about now. Stay tuned. And we're back in the live play, starting zoomed out here because I want to show you what has been built off camera. And that's what we'll focus on in the first part of this, and then we'll go into talk a little bit more in detail about what was built during the time lapse. So really, to kind of facilitate getting this area working properly, I've extended the West Side Highway all the way up to 42nd Street. I filled in a lot of blocks in various places, and I'll probably come back into this and fill them all in another time. A really great thing about using the new image overlay mod that I switched over to is it saves the position, so all I gotta do is click a button, boom, it's working, which was not the case with the previous mod. And the other thing that I built was I extended the FDR out. So let's take a quick closer look at this. We had previously built it right up to here, right up to the edge of Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village. And I've extended it further to interact with 34th Street. And this is disgusting under here. It's like such a complicated interchange, but it'll get hidden once this area gets built out and further detailed. But it's kind of an interesting interaction. I wanted to give all the cars coming out of this crude tunnel from what we built in the time lapse and give them a way to get downtown to where the bulk of the rest of the buildings are. And I also use this as an opportunity to show off some intersection marking tool and just kind of get a feel for how I want to start detailing highways in the city. Not fully decided yet, but good enough for now. And now, before we look at what we built, we're going to pop out real quick and show you subways. We've built some additional subways off camera. We showed during the time lapse building out the station at Hudson Yards. This is the 34th Street Hudson Yards station on the 7, which is the last IRT line, not one of the ones we built in the earlier episode when we built the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And this is this lovely fuchsia color, and it connects to what will eventually be Times Square, Bryant Park, and Grand Central. I've kind of hooked these up crudely here, but eventually the 7 train will continue on into Queens. I've just hooked this up now so they have access to the depot up there. And the other thing that I've been able to build for the first time ever building New York was putting in the shuttle. So we had kind of provided for this in that earlier episode, but now it's running, and I don't think anybody's using it because I don't think it makes sense for the Sims to be taking that route. But maybe that'll change as we continue to get the area filled in, which is what I've spent a lot of time doing off camera as well. So you saw a good amount of this being built, but I've gone ahead and filled in a few more blocks. I really wanted to get a lot more of these filled in, but only have so much time in the day, and I really did want to get this video out to you. It's been a little while. And as much as I like that shot here, there's another shot that I've probably used in the thumbnail, which is this kind of keyhole of the Empire State Building through Hudson Yards. And I actually checked on Google Maps, and this is a real view. There's nothing that I'm missing here. So you will be able to see through this just like it is in real life, which I think is really cool. And it actually lets you see kind of split right between these two large buildings, which is not part of Hudson Yards, actually called Manhattan West. And this one's a little bit shorter than the other. I've kind of sunk it into the ground here. And these buildings are meant to be more of like a blue glass, but they're not on the workshop. So I kind of took this building here and doubled it up, crossed it over itself. And I think that looks really nice, and it's providing for a much greater population in the city. We can look again later, but we're at about 52,000 now, up another 8,000 since the last episode. So we're really cooking here, really moving along. And then one area that I really didn't get to focus on during the video, and I wanted to, was to talk more about this park. So in real life, this park is Bella Abzug Park. She was a congresswoman from New York for 3 terms, and then had a failed Senate bid. And she apparently grew up in this side of the city. And they named this park after her, and I think it's really great that New York City is finding more ways to name more parks and build more monuments after famous and important women from the city and from elsewhere. And what else do we need to talk about? So, elephant in the room might be this large empty space here. This is the James Farley Post Office building. Part of which is now Moynihan Station, which is like the new grand entranceway for Amtrak. It's really nice, except it doesn't have any seating because the city doesn't know what to do with the homeless. And there's no asset for it. There is an asset for the original Penn Station. I could kind of use that. It's kind of the same shape and like style, but that asset's real broken, as I think I mentioned earlier on. So the other problem is that I really want to find a way to get underground train tracks in here to serve as the NJ Transit and into what is eventually the LIRR and Amtrak. The problem is that the mod that used to let me do that, which is extra train station tracks, something's up with it since the airports mod, and it seems that all of the underground train stations that are on the workshop are not working. So when you try to build underground, it like deforms the land and throws the tunnels in. So that's a bit of a problem, but overall, I'm really happy with how this episode's come out. It feels really good to kind of connect up more of the city and see cars using faster modes of transit, most particularly the subway, which is just absolutely taking off now. Oh, look at that. We just hit over 1,000 residents per week, which I know at a 51,000 doesn't sound like a ton, but for the way the game calculates these things, it really is quite a lot. And really that was building the 7. So all the commercial and all the residential that are here, people are essentially taking one of these routes, from the 7 to the 1, 2, 3, or from the 7 to the 4, 5, 6, much like they would in real life. Almost like the IRT designed it that way, but it's allowing the city to continue to have really decent traffic flow. Obviously there's a few hot spots, but having a city of this size in the 70s is totally reasonable. And just don't look at the Lincoln Tunnel here. I've only built the one entranceway, the one tube, just to feed the city, but we'll definitely expand upon that in the future and build that entire tunnel out. It's horrible. It's like one of the worst things to build in this build, I can guarantee you that. But this wasn't one of the worst things to build. For everyone who wanted Midtown, thank you for suggesting it. Please suggest something else down in the comments. What would you like to see next? I haven't started yet, and I really like to know what you think. So thank you so much as always for sticking around, and subscribe and like if you haven't, and we'll see you next time. Bye.